to study issues around stratification, around difference, around inequality. And in particular, people were interested in really challenging to many extent, to a large extent, around the prevailing academic culture, to change the relationship, the kind of long-established relationship between researcher and the researched. And really, as Troy quite nicely talked about, with a real emphasis of not only studying social change, but affecting social change outcomes, and to really demonstrate the impactfulness, if you will, of the kind of research on communities that have been traditionally disempowered. I'm going to actually truncate some of the bios in the program in the interest of time, but you'll see in your program, each of the panelists has a full set of accomplishments there, and I'm going to police the time carefully as well. And so we're just going to start right into things with Fernando Burga, who received his PhD from the Department of City and Regional Planning here at Berkeley in 2013, and was a graduate fellow at the Institute from 2011 to 2013. And Fernando Burga is currently a lecturer in urban studies and planning at San Francisco State University, and a visiting scholar here at the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. So with that, let's welcome Fernando Burga.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me see if I can find my PowerPoint. Okay. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Fernando Burga. It has been mentioned. I'm a former fellow. I'm really happy to be here. It's quite an honor to share with you a set of ideas and reflections from some work that I've been doing. Let me give you a little bit of bio also that is complementary to the information that you have on your brochures. I'm an architect by professional training, so I worked for many years as an architect. And design and also design thinking has been a very important part of my upbringing, but also my research. Specifically, my research for the PhD dissertation was on Metropolitan Miami. It looked at the Cuban American community and literally how they influenced and used planning mechanisms in order to gain political incorporation and political power. The story of Cuban Americans in Miami has been told by many important sociologists and anthropologists, Alejandro Portes, Alex Tepek, among others. But what I did with my dissertation is I gave a spatial dimension to this question of political incorporation by immigrants. This scope of research is something that, in a sense, I'm trying now to bring back into some sort of pedagogy and also professional practice to a degree. So the points that I'm going to share with you today have to do with that. In no way is it a model or anything of that sort. It's basically a set of tactics which I'm going to refer to as design justice. This idea of design justice, which is a definition that actually some of us here at the ISSI are working at, including Ricardo Huerta Niño, who, I don't know if he's here, he may come later, is the application of design thinking methods, tools, and values to achieve measurable results in social, economic, and racial justice for poor and marginalized communities. This was a definition that arose from a set of conversations that have to do with a community that we have here. Obviously, the fellows represent almost like a family. David, Christine, and Deborah have been very influential in helping us and in a sense, nurturing us to think about social issues as we move forth through our work, but also the larger community, the larger network of scholars here, the activities, and also having the platforms to be able to have these conversations, which in many other places at UC campus, in my opinion, are difficult to have. So design justice is basically a notion which is not about a concept, but also a way of doing things. It's a design justice is thinking about design as a tool, but also designing justice. And what does that mean also for professional practitioners, for designers who may be working in the fields of architecture, urban design, and planning, which, as some of you may know, are also very much invested and have a long history of racial problems and challenges. So in a way, we're trying to create this little tactic that may question some of these practices. The sort of like cases that I'm going to present to you, there's three of them. The first one is mostly focused on pedagogy, a class that I co-taught with another student at the Department of City and Regional Planning, Ariel Birbam, who's not here today. It's called Race and Equity. Then another class which I taught at San Jose State. We're going to go from here to the South Bay. And the class was called Community Assessment class. It was a studio that I taught on in a specific immigrant community called Washington Neighborhood. And now some work that I'm doing currently called also community assessment. From this class, I went from being an instructor to actually being a manager. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and this weird term community assessment, which also starts to place value on what a community is. And this is being carried out by the Nation Center at Santa Clara University. So the race and equity class was taught about a year and a half ago at the DCRP. It arose from a conversation between a lot of master's students and PhD students. There were really latent issues happening within the department that had to do with a true and real conversation about race. And basically, the matter of fact was that there weren't really deep conversations about race in the department, and many of us felt that we needed to talk about this issue. In a sense, this post-racial notion had already become kind of like prevalent, and we wanted to bring it back to another condition. So we mobilized and we brought together a set of actors, both within different departments, to be able to have this class, and it worked out pretty well. The class was basically about how do we start to use design methods to talk about race. And a conversation about race is a very difficult conversation to have, as some of you may have experienced. It requires many challenges, it requires a lot of reflection, and there's a lot of different positions about your own identity that need to be put and be borne out in order to have a productive conversation, rather than just make it an exercise that can be purely academic, can be purely textual. And what we did is we used many different design mechanisms in order to have these types of conversations. Literally, here are some examples that I'm sharing with you. We took texts and, in a sense, we visualized them. In a sense, to also think about and discuss this idea of the text as a colonizing tool, in a sense, and what did that mean. We also had, within the disciplines of planning and architecture and landscape architecture, you have many times schisms between the disciplines. You have almost like racial communities going on here that do not communicate with each other very well. Sometimes planners do not want to actually, they don't want to talk to designers. They think designers are just making pretty things. And designers think planners are just complicating things and they don't really get things done. I'm just reducing here a little bit. But in a sense, we wanted to talk also about the different divisions between these disciplines and what did this mean, and how can we cross-discipline in a sense, and how can design and representation and visualization and using these methods in order to come up with new ways of actually capturing information and making information compelling for people who are not like us. How can we make that happen? So we tried out with different things, you know, and this is not something very complicated. It's not something that requires a lot of sophistication. In fact, it's about paper and pen, and it's about talking about the idea of power and who has the pen, and what does it mean when you represent power through the line or through the word, and how do we make that into a more comprehensive conversation about our own professional disciplines. Here are some examples basically which are about using design, which are about deconstructing design into simple acts that are discrete but involve conversation, involve discussion, involve negotiation, and through that also a conversation about race and about text. It wasn't just about design. We also talked a lot about texts, and very important texts that make part of this canon of racial studies, and also about a canon of planning and race. I'm going to move forward because I have a lot of material to show you, but that basically embraces this class. We did a lot of drawing, a lot of writing, a lot of visualizing ideas, and explaining through that process. And in a sense, it was a process of translation, using design as a method of translation and being able to capture information. What you see here are sort of like the first evidences of what would be boards, literally design boards or posters, which the students would eventually design at the end. And here we have some of the basic ideas, looking at Anaheim, for example, urban recycling, looking at expressways in San Francisco as, you know, usually the typical sort of like planning intervention that destroys marginalized communities. But there were many others. What we did is we started to think about design as literally a physical activity. You know, it's not just pen and paper. It's not just about visualizing text. It's actually about deconstructing design and creating things that you can create into tactile objects so you can share and talk and negotiate. And here what you have basically is one of these boards starting to be created. We're taking pieces, we're putting them together, and what we're doing is we're trying to equalize the power relation. And we talked about that. We talked about the power of design, but also the power of the text, and who is excluded in this conversation. And then we brought this over to other layers of design, which involve also other types of representation. Here you have the translation of that board from the left to the right into something that is more tactile, into something that is more drawn. Slowly but surely, each of these steps required negotiation and providing and giving and discussing and being disempowered but also empowering in that motion and talking through the ideas of race and equity, which was the center of the class. Here we have basically some of the boards starting to come together. On the left you have one of our students who did this really interesting project called the reflexive gentrifier, in which she really started to think about her own positionality as a white woman working and living in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. And this was a really interesting process. But it was always productive in the sense that the conversation didn't become a complicated conversation about race or about guilt or about why didn't you do this or what could you do better. It was something that was always part of the exercise of design in a sense. And it was a process that involved layers of interpretation and layers of doing. This was another compelling product of the actual class, that students actually learned to think about their process through design. We think about papers and we think about writing through outlines, but design became part of their academic work also. And that was something that was very compelling for them, something that also empowered them. And also it turned these very basic tools of design, like very simple stuff like teaching Adobe software products, Photoshop, Illustrator, into design, into an actual a process of learning that involved a message, involved a learning process that was transformative. It wasn't just teaching representation, but it was also being able to think about why you're doing this and how you do it. Thank you so much. There was a performative aspect to this. It involved providing actually a situation, which was about having a final review in which people come and discuss this. This becomes a larger conversation. It's not just about the students. And now I'm going to move on to San Jose State. My time is running out, so I have to go fast. I am working right now in this community called Washington Neighborhood in San Jose, which actually, if I may step here, is actually right It's sort of like between what are the red dots, which are mostly the white populations in San Jose, and then the green dots, which are mostly the Asian populations. And in between you have a little bit of mixture of colors and orange. The orange is actually Hispanics. Basically, this is a neighborhood which is at the verge of gentrification in San Jose. It's really close to the downtown area. There's going to be a lot of issues of displacement, a lot of challenges. But I came into the middle of this class while there was a huge mobilization happening with a group of mothers in this school called Washington Elementary. The mothers were against the actual construction of a charter school by this organization called Rocket Ship, and there were a lot of political challenges and issues going on. What I did with my class is I basically used this planning class in order to provide a platform for the mothers, in order for them to voice their concerns and also be able to place and record their needs onto the planning boards, the students' work, which in a sense becomes a record, but it becomes also a formal tool that navigates and goes around the planning department and many other actors within the city. I suggest that you check out this website because there's a lot of interesting information about how this mobilization happened and actually succeeded. But basically, these were my clients in a way, right? And in planning and design and in these disciplines, these professional disciplines, you have clients. But what we did, well, not only me, but also the students in this class, is we turned to the mothers as our clients and how can we provide them with a voice. This also led to another set of situations which were about providing spaces where people could discuss, and literally we could present the information with the mothers, so the mothers not only produced the information, but they also owned the boards in many ways. And here are some examples. Some of these mappings, which are sort of like the last layer of that design exercise, which I've discussed, right, in another context, they involve mapping. These mappings were carried out from beginning to end with the mothers. And many times we did things, we carried out other tactics, such as having the children translate for us, and having the children at the forefront and having the mothers with the children translate together what this information was about. It was a complicated process. It was definitely a challenging process, but it was ultimately a way of providing the information for them and being able for them, providing them the platform to carry out the work that they wanted to do. Oops, that one didn't work very well. Ultimately, we looked at this idea of the charter school being situated, and we did have a position about it, which was about questioning what this issue was and how can we have a broader conversation which involves the mothers but also other actors in San Jose in regards to this issue. Currently, I'm working with the same group of mothers through the Ignatian Center at Santa Clara University, and this involves another type of relationship which is similar to using design methods in order to come up with provisions that they actually need through the Ignatian Center of Santa Clara. And this involves interesting methods such as designing surveys and conveying surveys and being able to provide that information, but also coming up with other ways of representing what their world is like and what are the needs that they have, and how can we tell stories, ethnographic stories arguably, about the mothers and their lives in this community so that the Ignatian Center in Santa Clara is able to actually provide the right provisions for them. This is just an example of one diagram that we use from a book. I can give you the title after, but it's thinking about literally the social life of this community and how there's a network of actors that make this community, and how can we represent that. We also use wordles, and wordles are interesting sort of like tools because they're very simple and they're almost cliched, but they're very powerful. What they do is that they translate survey material that may be very complicated to read and actually to translate and to provide back as information into compelling representations that people can relate to and people can own in many ways. This is some of the other exercises that we've been carrying out. And slowly but surely what has been happening is that the mothers have been starting to acquire a sense of agency in this process of designing the work themselves. And to me, that's a very rewarding experience. I want to finish with, this is my almost last slide, that this is a relationship which is still happening, and it's a tense relationship, right? And it's a tense relationship that also is about my own position, right? A Hispanic man of privilege coming from Miami, working in this community. But it's a relationship that I'm always reminded about the value of that relationship. And literally, here is Maria Cermeño, who is actually one of the mothers, one of the leaders. Sorry, Maria Marcelo, she always reminds me, so like, Fernando, you have to do this. Fernando, you have to come to the community. You have to attend to our Cinco de Mayo celebration. She's always after me. She was always reminding me that I'm, in a sense, she's my client. And that's something that I have to be able to provide for her and be able to be there and build this relationship in a sense that is productive for her. And this is something that is very rewarding for me and initially also very transformative. So just some last points to talk about, to think about the idea of searching for design justice. It involves a practice which is about reinvigorating the design professions. It's something that can happen in the field of education. It involves data, data visualization, data representation, and coming up with new ways of representing data and designing data. And it involves a situation, a performance. And that is also a place where a new type of politics can be found for the professional design professionals. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernando, very much. Teresa Cordova received her PhD here at UC Berkeley and was involved with the Institute for the Study of Social Change between 1978 and 1984. And I'm sure she's very pleased to be here now to see old colleagues, but in fact to escape what was a very brutal winter in Chicago. Teresa Cordova is director of the Great Cities Institute and a professor of urban planning and policy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So a warm welcome for Teresa Cordova. Let's switch this out. Yeah. I'm not sure what to do with this. Oh, you're going to leave it up? Okay. Got it.
Hello. I am indeed very happy to be here. This is really exciting. It gives us an opportunity to reflect and to reminisce. So there are lots of good people and good memories at the Institute. So Janice, I remember well when you helped me type, because back in those days we used typewriters, not computers, for our dissertation, picking me up at 5:30 in the morning to do the final printing and all of that. One of the things I love about this photograph, if you can see the bench at the Institute, how vital that bench has been over the years, the mailbox, the kitchen area. But what I really want you to pay attention to is that picture of Troy. It's like he's got yeah, right, it's happening, right? So good people, good memories at the Institute. The Institute, we called it the Institute. That's all we had to say, was the Institute. It was a place of refuge and understanding, a home away from home. I recall my own days of trying to figure out how to be a graduate student, working all night long on the typewriter. The Institute is a space for interaction with and among scholars. It was a place where we could discuss race. And you mentioned earlier, Troy, Herb Mills. I remember being there late and Herb Mills coming in and having a chance to interact with him, to interact with people like Diane Beeson, who was doing her research. But the Institute is and was still a source of mentorship and guidance, and it was a place where we had access to resources and to tools. Troy, in his study on diversity, and I was so pleased to see the revised or the republished second edition of the diversity report, which is a very important report, and David Montejano, in his recent book on brown berets and the Chicano movement in Texas, emphasized the importance of a place, a space. The Institute was that for us. Now, I have lots of photographs also of David Montejano, but the only ones I had were at parties. So I figured I wouldn't show those, and there were of him dancing. You know, he's quite a dancer, you know. But we danced, we at the Institute. We sang. We made fun of each other. We broke bread. We broke glasses. We broke barriers. I want to point out also something about David. He's quite a scholar. I was so incredibly proud of him for his appearance on the PBS series Latino Americans, when he so eloquently demonstrated the value of Chicano studies scholarship in bringing forth an important historical account and analysis of Mexican American sociological history. And now he helps carry on the ISSI legacy. I want to congratulate the organizers on this event. Deborah, Christine, you've done an amazing, tremendous job. It's really been a pleasure to work with you over these last few months. The tightness of the organization has really, truly been great. So thank you very much. When I was here at Berkeley, two of the classes that stand out for me, well, there are many that did, but two that I want to point to, one of them was with David, actually, on social change. And the core of the class was analyzing from feudalism to capitalism. I was like, feudalism to capitalism? Why are we talking about this, right? I didn't get it immediately. And yet this class set the stage for me to understand the transformation of political economies, the economic restructuring that began in the mid-70s, how and why globalization occurred, and why the regime of neoliberal policies is so important to oppose. Yet knowledge of the overwhelming forces of dominant institutionalized forces did not sway my passion to understand how individuals, how I, as a social change scholar, could make a difference. I convinced David Matza to teach a special seminar on C. Wright Mills. I convinced David to do this class on C. Wright Mills so that we could focus on how our sociology could be useful beyond itself, and to help me in my search for understanding the potential power of individuals in the face of entrenched structures and institutionalized power. As a result, I have articulated a theory of social change and a parallel theory of social action that has and still guides my social change work, including my engaging with communities as partners in the struggle for place and space with racial justice in mind. In the few minutes that I have, I will briefly describe how I came to these theories and even less time on examples of what I've done with it. I refer to my work as a scholarship of engagement. I conclude with acknowledging my appreciation for the mentors that still guide me. My scholarship of engagement stems from a set of values and principles. It employs a multi-method set of tools and is based on a theory of social action. Values that guide my work have a firm basis in culture and place and a commitment to the concept of community building. Excellence and accuracy are important, and thus I consciously and carefully apply standards of rigor and methodologies of social science research and participatory action research mixed with planning processes and techniques. My work is informed by a theory of social action that I describe as conscious strategic engagement. My work is an integration of research, pedagogy, and action. Always, my work will be related to my roots and to the responsibilities that I feel for the betterment of communities. My goal, therefore, is to integrate all aspects of my work to address questions of positive social change. On the basis of those roots, I value place, culture, and community. I also value my education and am driven by the sense of responsibility to connect that education with needs of place, culture, and community. Survival is at stake when we consider some of the political economic dynamics that can and do disrupt and destroy place, culture, and community. The question for me is how to contribute to the betterment of society by integrating research, teaching, and service. It was a persistent desire to understand the world around me that led me to seek out a research experience as a college sophomore at the University of Denver. In this project, I learned the value of a multi-method approach to community studies, including economic base analysis, survey research, in-depth interviews. That opportunity then led to another, and soon I was running the statistical laboratory for the sociology department at DU, which meant I was actively involved in the generation and analysis of quantitative data for purposes of social research. There I found models of good sociological research, a la Penelope Cannan. While still an undergraduate, I was also steeped in the study of symbolic interaction, situated action and the vocabulary of motive, self and society, and the generalized other. Studying with Professor David Franks, I read and enjoyed the works of C. Wright Mills, George Herbert Mead, Herbert Bloomer, and others, and Bloomer at that time was here at Berkeley. What was most powerful and useful to me was grasping the concepts of interaction and emergence. I came to see not only the self, but also society as the emergent product of process of interaction. Combining the study of communities and the dynamics of interactive processes, I began to formulate a way of seeing communities as an emergent product of an interactive process. Yet having studied social structure and social organization theory, I knew that I would have to find a way to understand the interrelationships between process and structure. I was intrigued with questions about the relationship between individual actions and institutionalized social structures. If I were interested in community change, then how would I understand the ability of an individual to affect the development of society given the constraints of social structure? Is social structure irrelevant, as some might claim? Or is it primary? Does the system determine social change, or is it purely the power of individual action? These questions, of course, permeate social policy debates with respect to attributing blame and assigning advantage. If the system is responsible, then the individual is relieved of his or her responsibility, or more to the point, has no agency. It is the individual who is responsible. Then any individual has equal advantage in affecting their lives. If the individual is responsible, then any individual has advantage in affecting their lives as well as society. Social structure in that instance holds no explanatory power. Neither view was complete. My goal was to understand the relationship between individual and society in order to understand how to affect social change, in particular community change. What was at stake for me in this regard was community itself, its very concept. I saw community as a set of social relations, how we get along. I also saw community as a place. Community was something important to value and to seek and to have a role in shaping. I then sought to understand the larger context and the factors that explained the relationship of individuals to communities. I needed to understand political economy. In graduate school, of course, my focus was the study of social change. The fellowships of the ISSI Minority Fellowship and, of course, the National Institute of Mental Health Fellowship with the Institute was key. This pursuit led to the study of macro theories of social change, social stratification, and the political economy of development. My study with Professors Duster and David Matza led to an illuminated understanding of how race and class acted as powerful variables to explain patterns of social relations and institutionalized power. Both had written influential books in the area of sociology of deviance, Duster's Legislation of Morality, Matza's Becoming Deviant. The social construction of structure, that is, what was normal and what was deviant, posed a fundamental challenge to classic sociological theories of functionalism that justified stratified social relations and the assignment of privilege in society. My commitment to Chicano studies also began during this time. I'll skip over that, but to point out that there is a useful body of work done by Chicano studies scholars, many of which examine the impacts of historical change on the social structures of urban areas, with an emphasis, of course, on how these changes impacted longstanding Chicano communities. My analysis also extended to people of color, and I became involved in planning and political work involving Black-Latino relations and communities of color. While serving on the City of Berkeley Planning Commission, for example, I initiated efforts to tackle community development issues in South Berkeley. I also worked with Black-Latino coalitions in the Bay Area and later in Chicago. My own fight for a place within the university led me to understand how I, as a Chicana, could understand the intersections of class, race, and gender. Simultaneously, I developed strategies to find a place and a voice, un sitio y una lengua, and developed an articulated Chicana feminism, thus joining a generation and critical mass of Chicana scholars who entered graduate school at the same moment in history. While in Berkeley, I also taught a course through which I led the founding and institutionalization of the Empowering Women of Color Conference that is about to celebrate its 30th year. During graduate school, I studied the dynamics and significance of the concept of discourse, its function, the production of what is considered legitimate knowledge, and thus the tie between power and knowledge. This provided me also the opportunity to study the tie between discourse and social change, whether it's a study of Foucault, Birmingham School, Stuart Hall, Critical Theory, Frankfurt School, Gramsci. The latter's concept of cultural hegemony also suggested the importance of counter-hegemonic strategies. This reinforced the importance of consciousness and how one approached meaning and mobilization. While at Berkeley, I had a semester class with Alain Touraine and became immersed in his concepts of the self-production of society, social movements acting on society, and conflict over shared stakes. I studied with Manuel Castells, himself influenced by Touraine, who was writing and lecturing about the power of the grassroots in affecting social change, and in particular shaping cities. To win the battle over urban meaning required conscious mobilization that challenged the logic of how dominant interests were institutionalized. There's more there, but for reasons of time, I'll cut that out. I also, although I did time this, by the way, I read it out loud and timed it. I was interested in the role of large institutions such as corporations in social and community change. In my doctoral dissertation, I looked at the U.S. military in trying to acquire land around mechanized military maneuvers. And at that time, I became very interested in the local. What was the power of the local, right? And that research, along with my work in the City of Berkeley Planning Commission and with Mayor Gus Newport's office, embedded in me an understanding of the connection of land use to community development and the possibilities through local governance. Just a few more points. This theoretical journey that I describe, and somewhat cut short, led me to identify a theory of social change, a way to understand how communities changed. I came to understand the formation of cities as a function of a process of conflict over shared stakes, that the process was conditioned by structural variables, including those that reinforced institutionalized interest, that these institutionalized interests were reinforced through ideology and discourse, that actors needed to engage consciously and strategically so as to have influence on that process, and that communities were always in a process of being shaped. Can I get my water? The protracted formation, thank you. The protracted formation of a community was an emergent product of a structurally conditioned, interactive process of conflict. This was the answer for me of how communities changed and the potential role of the individual and organizations in that change. This way of thinking about social change became the basis for my thinking about how to engage in that change for the purpose of contributing to the betterment of communities. Thus, the question was how to effectively engage in those processes of change. Consciously engaging in what I call a structurally conditioned, interacted, protracted process of conflict is a way to affect the development of communities in a way that promotes their survival and their sustainability. My writings and practice throughout this journey reflect the application of these theoretical concepts. And all the while, I remain committed to the concept of community, especially the importance of community building. And I think of myself as a conscious actor then, attempting to impact the outcome of this process of shaping. All right, skipping through this. As a university professor impassioned with this purpose, I have positioned myself in multiple roles, all of which involve forming relationships and partnerships. The range included grassroots organizing, community development work, research and analysis, policy making as a local elected official, and even commenting or being a commentator on a local news show. With more time, I would tell you about my work with the Resource Center for DASA Planning and how we inserted ourselves into the process to have an impact on neighborhood change, infrastructure design and provision, economic development policy and projects, land use and agricultural preservation. With more time, I would share with you stories of my social change work as a county commissioner and how I brought needed infrastructure projects and improvements, economic development, amenities such as open space and parks, a medical clinic, youth facilities, and various services to my district, while also initiating several long-range planning projects. With more time, I would provide details on my current work as director of UIC's Great Cities Institute. Our tagline is harnessing the power of research, solutions for today's urban challenges. And the Great Cities Institute engages a range of partners to analyze issues and formulate solutions to tackle the multidimensional challenges of the changing socio-political economy of urban regions. Our research supports urban research to improve the quality of life in Chicago and great cities around the world. While we celebrate 35 years of training social change scholars, the urgency remains. And being in the Great Cities role allows me to put all of this together. But as I say, the urgency remains. Troy mentioned Reagan. By the time I left here, Reagan had already been elected. And I think at that time, even though we were doing the anti-apartheid work, I don't think we realized at that time just how devastating the ushering in of the neoliberal era of economic restructuring neoliberalism that Reagan represented. So, meanwhile, we have poverty, fragmentation, criminalization, marginalization. More than ever, right, there is an urgency because we are literally, so much is literally at stake. So there is value in connecting social change, scholarship, and the work, scholarship and the work of social change. And the work of this institute over all these years has been very critical. It was an era of institutional support by the public sector for the education of its citizenry, and that matters. And I think a lot of what Troy said points to that. We're at a time when the high costs of higher education are high. We're seeing the commodification of universities, a decline, and the abdication on the part of the public sector of higher education. But it does matter. But someone had a vision and cared enough to make it possible for the Institute to happen. and for the people to carry that forward. So imagine my delight when I was able to invite Professor Duster to come to the Great Cities Institute and speak there. And at that time, he spoke that the art that bends towards justice requires an accelerator. That accelerator being our engagement, right? So that continues to be really important. But we are very influenced by our mentors. And there's a lot of things that we do that we learned from our mentors. So, if you see me doing this when I'm talking, you'll know where I got it from. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Sorry to rush you, but we need to sort of keep things on track here. Eleanor Mason Ramsey received a PhD in anthropology from here at UC Berkeley and was a longtime resident of the Institute for the Study of Social Change between 1977 and 1984. And also, as you can see by her description in the program, has sort of underscored the importance of not only working within, but from the outside of the formal academic community. And in particular, she's been involved in a lot of issues around racial and gender disparities across a wide variety of social institutions and domains. Eleanor Mason Ramsey is currently the president of Mason Tillman Associates, a social marketing and public policy research firm based here in Oakland, California. So a welcome for Eleanor Mason Ramsey.
Well, good morning. It is for me a real pleasure to have even been thought of when this program was planned. My stay at the Institute was not as a young impressionable, but an older impressionable student. And I have a sense that the way I made the Institute my home was somewhat different from others, but it probably is one of the reasons that David and I became, as my son would say, kinfolk, because we went about our views of life a little different than most at the time. And it was clearly a time when things were quite different. One of the things, though, about that difference that has stayed the same is access was very limited, and certainly access for women. And when Troy offered me an opportunity to house my fellowship, and I wasn't quite certain how and why it was awarded to me, but fortunately there was a social policy called affirmative action, and I fit it as an African-American woman who had received a degree. I'd like to say I earned the degree. There's some in society that say those degrees were granted to us because of, but I think I worked quite hard. And I also, in my anomaly at the Institute, I came as a mother of quite a few children. And managing it, I didn't get to as many parties as some of my peers did. Because while they were drinking beer, I don't think any of us could afford wine. I was having birthday parties with 2 and 3 candles on the cake. But nevertheless, I spent my days at the Institute, and for me it was a very exceptional experience. And David remains, as does Troy, in my memory, and Janice, who too was the person who sort of kept everything on the straight and narrow, made sure the funding agencies got their reports, and their reports reflected the work that we had been granted funds to perform. And I can still remember her preparing those in a timely fashion. But David was that person who stood out as being on the edge, and for me, as a student, albeit not very young, but yet impressionable, to know that you could be on the edge and it would be okay, and you were reinforced and supported in that endeavor. And even I think it was Elk somewhere up in the northern part David moved to, and I thought, how do you leave Berkeley and go anyplace else? But David not only did it and commuted, as many of you may know. But while at the Institute and having the exchanges that I had on those occasions when I could afford to be around other than during the work that I had commissioned to do when I received my fellowship, because it did carry some responsibilities and you did need to provide some product at certain periods. But I also was fortunate enough in those, during that period at the Institute, to secure other work, doing contractual work. And it was in that context and the kind of encouragement and insights I gained at the Institute that I began to see that there were places that you could make a difference in society at large. And if you had the fortitude to resist the negativity that prevailed at the time, where there was a concept, there were two sort of models, one that society should change and change was good, and then there was really the institutional state view that it really was going to remain the same, so that the surface was changing, but the institutional structures were the same. And thus, to endeavor to do change in an applied fashion, and I have spent my career since the late 70s doing applied research, that you did have to find yourself insulated in a little Teflon, because you had to be radioactive in order to affect change, and that didn't endear you to those that were holding on to the institutional norms. So it was fun, and it was strategy and tenacity that I acquired at the Institute and acquired watching Troy and Minkus, as we would call David. I don't know. David didn't have a name for us. He was just Minkus, and certainly my David was. But just watching those guys travel and maneuver through the university gave me those strategies. And so over the last, since the late 70s, after leaving the Institute, actually I sort of endeavored to be an entrepreneur before leaving, and one day when indeed I decided I should pack my boxes because I thought that Troy might put them on the front porch, and I packed them and took them home to my home office. Subsequently, my husband packed them up and put me out of that because there were too many people in his refrigerator. But that was sort of the movement from home office to a public space. Home office, for those of you who may have endeavored to become entrepreneurial, find that it's high status to have a home office. Well, in the late 70s and the early 80s, it was seen as someone who did not know how to form a business and operate a business if it was based in your home. Mine was based in my home because I couldn't afford to pay rent. And it was a very practical, and it was sort of like being at the Institute, but it was really at my husband's home, subject to eviction on any day because there was too much treading through his house. But we did that for a number of years, and I found myself in a space where there became a demand in the early 80s to deal with the question of the introduction of people of color into public contracting. And there was legislation passed at the time that the Surface Transportation Assistance Act was passed, which was in conjunction with the gasoline tax. And you may not recall it because it's so much part of what you pay at the pump, but there was a point in which Congress did introduce a 10% gasoline tax. That tax afforded monies for building infrastructure, which we now know as freeways throughout the nation. It created a group of entrepreneurs called highway construction contractors. And in the work that I do, we are studying access to those contracts for people of color. And what's notable in the context of the university studies of social change, those individuals who were pouring concrete in driveways when prior to the passage of the Surface Transportation Act in 1982, which really became effective in the late 80s, they moved from pouring concrete in driveways to building freeways, but they didn't give access to women or people of color. And when Congress said that access had to be afforded those groups, at least 10% of the dollars spent should go to those groups, those particular companies nationwide who had formerly been using wheelbarrows to transport their concrete said they can't come in because they are not deserving of access. And so for the last 20-some years, I've been doing studies which analyzes access to contracting for people of color. And we do it using many of the models that you use in the university, where we're looking at the availability of businesses in the different industries by race and gender and by capacity to perform work. And we then study the level of access that they receive by local governments. And so we are doing basically a comparative analysis of whether the available businesses gain the or receive the contracting that they should receive based on the percent of availability that they have in the marketplace. And that in most communities results in finding that people of color, particularly African Americans and Hispanics and Caucasian females, are underutilized. And if that underutilization is statistically significant, there is a constitutional obligation on the part of local government to institute remedies to correct it. And once you propose those remedies, that's when all hell breaks loose, because that's about social change. And there's great resistance. And what was at the beginning of a study an endearment with your endearing relationship with your client becomes antagonistic with your client, because your client engaged you to do this for various reasons. We had one client who wanted to build a stadium for the Oilers, and the African American caucus for the city of Nashville said, to do so, you have to have a program that gives African American contractors an opportunity. And so they said, oh, no problem, we'll do that if that's what it takes to get your vote to build the stadium for the Oilers. Well, when we finished and the recommendation was to actually institute a program that set goals for the participation of African Americans, it all went south, because they did it to get, they had an agenda, but their agenda, while the mechanism was to do the study, that outcome was not something that they wanted to have. And so the warm, friendly relationship that engaged us turned sour when we were moving to promote change. But I've enjoyed it. I like to do it. I don't find being antagonistic difficult. Sometimes it causes you to think long and hard, but you can be very strategic. And it is indeed fun to be able to be the winner and leave in the communities that I work a benefit for all of those people who are entitled and should have access. And for that, I thank my experience at the university. I thank Troy for both accepting and enduring and tolerating, and David for giving me a model of what you can do if you work on the edge. You can still bring things to the center and make them effective. And so to all, thank you, and I'm glad the Institute is still around.
Thank you, Eleanor. Actually, we're going to now have some conversation, and hopefully you have some comments, questions, to create some dialogue here with the panelists. But before I do that, I want us to just take a moment and, well, first of all, thank all the panelists on this. Thank you very much for presentations and for our heavy-handed policing of the time. But I also want to acknowledge and have a note of appreciation for the conference organizers, Christine Trost and Deborah Lustig, who've done a marvelous job in putting this together. Also the conference committee, as well as current and former participants, graduate student participants in the graduate training program who have served as volunteers today. So a warm welcome for all, huh? All right, I'll take folks from the floor. I think there's a mic circulating as well. If you could raise your hand, and Yen will come around. Not all at once. Also, yeah, please address any sort of comments and questions. Try to make them succinct here, too. Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Fernando. I'm wondering how, I'm interested in the process of interrogating different designs, research designs and techniques, and I'm wondering how that's been received by other scholars and researchers that are in terms of creating participation for research or other such techniques as well. So essentially, how has that been received, or in your experience?
Fernando, you want to come up here? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Is there another mic up here, Deborah? Oh.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that there is a lot of conversations between professionals from the design fields that are about how methods, both research methods and also design tendencies can converge. But it's really rare for, in my opinion, and in my research also, and in my perspective, to see it actually work. I think that it tends to be more rhetorical. One of the interesting things that I really have learned here at the center, at the ISSI and at the Center for the Study of Research Social Change, is this interdisciplinary conversation, right? So between sociologists, anthropologists, and arguably an architect and urban designer who's asking sociological or anthropological questions, right? Which means that I do not need to be a sociologist or an anthropologist to be able to have that conversation, right? And yet I can contribute also to their work, and I can also help them and engage them in that work. I'll give you more concrete examples. In the field of planning, for example, there is a methodology which is environmental, based on environmental psychology, and it's looking at diagnostics and things in the built environment that are design-based and design-oriented, and they deal with things that are about infrastructure and change, and arguably social change too. It's a very scientific way to look at the built environment. But usually, it doesn't ask questions of structure or agency or race, for example, which is something that I find limiting, for example, as a professional. I think that professionals are thinking about these questions too, literally, when they are in front of the computer designing a floor plan, arguably. But they don't have the capacity nor the access to the methods to do that. And then on the other side also, I do believe that many planning questions which are about ethnography or quantitative data gathering and representation could involve design as a way to translate and as a way to communicate and as a way to provide seeds so that people can actually engage those conversations in a much more productive manner. I don't think it's happening yet, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of work on it, but it's hard to merge the actual rigorous methods with the design conversation in a productive manner. Would you like that?
It's a great question. I want to take, I don't want to disagree too much with the fellow panelists, but except to the extent to say that I think there is a lot of that going on. And I think that's one of the nice things about what especially a community-based approach to planning does, right? Which is, it's integral to what we do. It's integral to the process. So even, for example, in the cases I could have talked about with related to infrastructure design, for example, whether it's roads, water supply, sewer, drainage systems, and so on. You know, when you think of, if one of the things that as a planner you can bring to that situation, a planner with a sociological, political, economic, social theory kind of approach to it, you can work alongside folks who also understand the connection between an infrastructure design, for example, and land use, and what that means even in terms of the future of their communities. What it means in terms of if there's a certain level of service that gets incorporated into design, that can mean that a whole area is going to blow up with a bunch of Walmarts, right? Or you can design it differently, and it can mean that instead you're going to have small businesses and put people to work in the small businesses. It can mean that you establish open space or parks, or you can fill it with sort of barbed wire fences around it. It means you can build 5-lane roads, or you can preserve historic highways or historic roadways and enhance the environmental and cultural landscape of that roadway. So that when you incorporate design, small d, not big D, because one of the things that we struggle as planners with a lot of the architects and some of the planners is around design big D, where design is but when you think about design small d, and it's really part of a much larger set of processes, then it becomes really important that you think then of the broader ways in which the other factors are part of that design. So even when we sat down with engineers, which we did on many of our projects, and we were part of those projects, the engineers started out with a very different notion of what that infrastructure project might mean, and by the time they were done working with us, they were able to expand their concept, and we were able to introduce multi-variables to the notion, working alongside community. But I think we probably should go to the next question rather than getting into
Oh.
Can I actually ask a question, if I may? So I'm curious about how do you define land use? Because I think land use is, in many ways, a hegemonic category. So I will wonder how, in your work, do you come up with a new category for land use, one which is based on the people that are from a community? Because I think design has the power to do that, for example. And in a similar fashion, when you think about infrastructural systems, for example, that may be a category that may be actually really difficult for a regular person to understand. So how do you translate this information, and is design part of that process?
You know, I can answer this question, and I'm going to try to not get into too much detail, because I imagine there's other kinds of questions or comments. One of the ways I would answer it would be to tell you stories of some of the many projects that we did. First of all, I want to say that people in communities understand a whole lot more than we give them credit for. At the same time, one of the things I'm always telling students, well, if you're not showing up with something that you're bringing to the table, then just stay home. So I don't like this, well, they know everything and we know nothing. We can't be disingenuous about what we also are bringing to the table. So it's pairing and partnering whatever skills, processes, techniques, experience within their understanding and so on. So just to give you an example of a water system, one of the areas that I worked in was involved as a community member, as a director of a research center, and then later represented as a county commissioner. It was an area that didn't have a municipal water system. And so a lot of it was semi-rural, and people really wanted to invest in and protect the rural quality of their community. And we did surveys to verify the fact that 90% of people in this community did want this sort of protection and did have these kinds of values. So so the engineers wanted to, their initial thing was like, we're going to invest all this money, let's do it at really this high level of development. And then they go to a meeting and the community folks are like, they're really upset, and they're like 150, 200 people are upset saying, we don't want this. And then engineers are going, why are they talking to us like this? Maybe we should wear suits next time. And we're like, no, no, no. If you listen to what people said, there were about 5 major categories that people raised as issues. Right? Why don't we organize a series of meetings around those 5 categories, those 5 topics? And let's give people a chance to sort of say what they have to say, raise the concerns they have to raise. You bring information in, you share it. And over a several-month period, we engaged in these meetings, and by the time we were done, we created a win-win situation where the county and the engineers felt comfortable about the investment, and the community then was able to emerge with a level of water system that A, they didn't have to sign up for if they didn't want to. Their wells were protected, and most importantly for them, their land use was protected. So when you're on the ground doing this stuff, you know, it's like there's a level at which you bring your conceptual and your theoretical understanding, but when you're on the ground, you have to bring your pragmatic hat. And when you sit at the table with people, you got to think about what it's going to take when you're sitting with people to move something in a way that you're affecting the outcome of that structurally conditioned, protracted, interactive process of conflict. So that what you end up with is something different by virtue of your presence and your engagement in it. And if you're working alongside communities, when you do that, what you end up with something that serves their interests as well. Serves their interests.
I'm going to move on. Next question. Freed down here.
Well, to continue this vein, I guess I have a question for all 3 panelists. One of the features of land use planning involves granting use permits for commercial activities, and one of the hallmarks of local control is that cities and counties can require use permit conditions to protect health and safety. Very often you get in land use situations where developers, commercial interests, want to overrun the use permit process and make short shrift with the conditional use review process and also water down conditions. I wonder, it's a question for all 3 of you, how would you apply what you've learned at the Institute, let's say, for working with local communities to give them a voice in the land use planning process to assure public health and safety?
Mm-hmm. Eleanor, would you like to comment?
I think one of the key issues in this is for the community to use its political structure and its elected politicians to ensure that the boards that are constituted are diversified and that they represent the socioeconomic interests as well as race and gender on those boards, and that the process that municipal governments use in that are fair and that the planning process is not violated. Nepotism in the process and the influence of developers is pretty profound in some cities. Some cities have more control over that process. So I think you have to infuse yourself in the process, and on those boards, the persons who are representing their communities have to be willing to adhere to the principles that brought them to it and not be coerced by the influence of the developers, because it can be very potent and very influential.
You know, something even as simple as a notification issue. It's like a lot of times, you know, some notifications where it has to be within, 50 feet and 7 days notice. But that's not enough distance and that's not enough time. So even as simple as something as simple as that, something as detailed as that can really make a difference. So that part of the engagement is that active vigilance and all those little regulations, all those dynamics of the process, right? So there's a lot more I can say about it.
Thank you for bringing back that question. I think this is one of those planning wicked problems, right? In the sense that we may be attributing a category a specific degree of power, which exists at this moment, but I would argue for a much more ethnographic view in this. There's stuff happening in the ground that requires attention and may challenge the category. And by that I mean land use, just the focus of land use as a tool, as a framework, whether you want to attach it to zoning or other types of measures, policy measures, because we may focus on land use and have a really good and productive discussion about land use, which is about the allocation of funding and infrastructure. And that may lead to more open space, for example, or designated zoning, right, or mixed-use zoning for that matter. But it does not necessarily deal with other issues that may be happening in a community, such as gentrification, such as a community needing political mobilization to be able to acquire that designated power in order to influence decision-making. I think those are the challenges that still exist within planning and architecture, and I would argue even within academia themselves and how we relate to these communities too. It's a discussion that needs to continue. Just to give you an example of how my case worked on, what we did, and this was a tactic, because I'm talking about a tactic, and I'm not talking about a model or something that should necessarily be repeated or a best practice. I'm actually against those type of things. The tactic was very simply to bring the conversation about zoning and zoning for a school that this community did not want, and a particular group of mothers in this community who felt threatened by this school, because literally this would challenge the history of social networks that they had born and developed and in many ways cultivated in this neighborhood, this really strong immigrant neighborhood. This would have completely destroyed those social networks. We placed that conversation on the planning work that the students did, and by association, the planning work that echoed through the echelons of San Jose City Hall. To me, that was a fruitful discussion, because what it meant was that you provided a voice, which was about a conversation about a zoning use, and how that zoning use had a particular value that was not being recorded, was not present, or was not being understood. And by doing that, then what you provide is you provide a platform for a group of people to actually mobilize and gain a voice. And that's as far as I would go, as far as like what would be the way to do this, because I actually think that every other type of intervention has its problems too, and we need to look at that also, and we need to question that and reevaluate that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Down in there.
Hi, my name is JP Abercrombie. I'm a graduate student in the Cultural Studies of Sport and Education. And my question is for each of the panelists. How would you define equity, inclusion, and diversity, and how does that inform your opinion or the engagement that you have with your current work and your work in the future?
Depends on what hat I wear. One hat says they all look like me, but that doesn't work too well over the long haul and in the larger world. But I do think it is a reflection of what the I'm sorry.
You have to talk.
I said at one at one level, I define it as all those people who look like me, but I understand that that has limitations as well. But the one model for looking at inclusion is to look at what's available and to ensure that the composition of your workplace or the composition of your contracting community or the composition of your educational institution is reflective of the population that is available to be served and the population that supports the institution that you're a part of. So for me, that is very important. How do I go about achieving equity in the work that I do and in the company that I own? I'm very active in trying to reach those communities where I can find people whose philosophy, worldview, comparable to what I think is necessary to bring about the change that I'm trying to achieve, and the people who have the courage of those convictions, which means when it gets difficult and people are opposed to your views, that you hold fast to them and get quite creative on how you develop strategies to try to convince them, both with the pen and other means, to support the views that you hold and have found to be important for your objectives. So it does vary in my profession at least.
That's a great question. I think I have to agree with the panelists with the definition. It's a great definition. I think that just to sort of like expand and elaborate a little bit on that, if I may sort of like place myself also in your answer, we all sort of like navigate and live different lives, right? And sort of like also institutional lives, personal lives, professional lives. And somehow I think that each of these realms, which they're more obviously, have in a sense their own definitions too, right? And we encounter them, they benefit us, they benefit others, we become part of that conversation. For me, it has been a learning process that is not over yet. It's a learning process that continues. It's a learning process that constantly surprises me, and it's about also how I have a conversation with my own identity and think about this question of equity and diversity, both as something that aids, challenges, and also it challenges me to actually become active in that work. I think that it's a process. If I may not give you a specific definition, I wouldn't want to do that, but definitely it's a process, and it's a process of changing and living and being able also to use those institutional, personal, professional definitions in a way that also, in my opinion, provides a political agenda that ultimately acquires a universal and sort of like forward and progressive oriented view of things.
There's lots of questions in the audience, so I'll just say very briefly, for me those things are desired outcomes. Those are goals. Those are things that I'm constantly engaged in, structurally conditioned, inserting myself as an actor in the structurally conditioned, protracted, interactive process of conflict to try to achieve it. So I'm always, everything I do, seeking to achieve inclusion, equity, justice, and fun.
I think we had some questions on this side, Yen, although the hands went down again.
Thank you. Thank you for all your comments. My name is Penelope Canan. My experience with Practica is that we might identify emerging leaders. We might empower them with methods that they didn't previously have, and therefore help them give voice to what they already may have known themselves. But then when we leave, we have created a vacuum unless we have created some bridge to support those champions to continue in their own agency. And so I wonder how you have faced that dilemma of essentially creating expectations and maybe even empowering people, but then you leave them and they're on their own in that same structure that you helped them begin to fight.
Great question again. I can't sleep at night thinking about that many times.
So there's two ways to think about this. The first thing is that I see myself as a tool for them. If I leave, I cannot be practicing in the field thinking that everything will fall apart. In my conversations, in my interactions, I'm very honest and very clear also about my own constraints and my own challenges and what I can and can't do. And this is the last picture that I'll show you with Maria and Marcelo, is about that conversation, which is a fun, engaging, difficult, demanding conversation, but a very useful and fruitful one for me. I'm actually also worried about this living me, in a sense, that this problem, this issue would escape me because I don't have the necessary capacities to continue the conversation or to evolve through the conversation, and that's also a constant thing for me. I think that, once again, we have to learn to navigate through all these different levels. I may be an institutional actor, and I may find strategies and tactics to go around that. I may be engaged as a person of color. I may be engaged as an entrepreneur. I may be engaged as somebody who cares about a particular activism issue. I may be engaged as a scholar. So these are all different hats that I think one can engage in order to always continue the conversation and also continue to challenge yourself through that process of learning.
I think one of the other considerations in the exit, since one moves from one space to another throughout one's career, is to try to leave communities with economic solvency. It is, the cultural aspects are very important, but if you're in poverty, it's very difficult to promote and sustain them. And so avenues to economic solvency, I think, are extraordinarily important, whatever communities we touch, for however long we're there.
It's a really interesting question. You know, I've always been and am very focused on the collective, right, and believe in the power of the collective. It's part of the concept of, for me, of community. And I think it's probably been only in recent years where I've come to really realize how key leadership is, even in the collective. And so that there's certain qualities of a leader that's able to do certain kinds of things. So, you know, you can build people's capacity, and maybe we build their capacities in various ways, but sometimes it's more difficult to build capacity around the intangibles, right? And one of the things I think that becomes key is the capacity to build community, right? It's one of the reasons why students who have taken classes from me for the last 20-some years know that I always talk about Phil Jackson in my community development classes, right? Being the great Chicago Bulls fan that I am and still am, and watching him throughout his career. But I find him interesting that in this highly competitive, highly capitalist endeavor where stars are supreme and there's so much focus on the individual, right, and the individual star, even though it's a team sport, to watch someone like him pull together teams and turn stars into team players and into champions. I mean, to me, it's not a coincidence that he's the winningest coach in history, right? There's something about his application of Zen Buddhism and Lakota Sioux philosophies that enables him to create these environments where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and where people think about their presence there as being greater than themselves, that their mission is somehow supersedes their individual priorities. And I think especially at a time with the sort of postmodernism and individuation and fragmentation, the art of pulling people together and holding people together in that collective enterprise to reach an outcome is something that should be part of that capacity building when we talk about working with communities or in any work that we do.
I have to draw this to a close soon, so maybe if
Wait,
there's...
one more question.
I'm sorry, Deborah. Should I close it?
We're still okay on time.
Okay, how about one more question? Because I want to create at least a space. Lunch is here for people to
I just
mingle
had a
before.
question for Eleanor. Since I know a lot of current and former graduate students are thinking about careers outside the academy, I'm wondering what advice you have for them.
Yeah, I
Well,
know, but-
one of the things, while in the academy, I think the academy should do a better job of providing access to information about options. And I, in fact, I suppose came to an option because I was confronted with doors that were locked. subsequently talked about glass ceiling. Well, ceiling was invisible, and I had no idea how to get out of the cage, at least through the academic channels. So I think one of the things that's important is to have better communication. As a business owner here in the county, it is very difficult to get meaningful information about students within the university. In fact, we're doing better in gaining access about students from abroad than we are right within our community. So I think the Academy should do a better job in that regard. I think on the other hand, as young professionals looking for an alternative to the Academy, you want to look at professional associations that might exist in an area where you think you may want to work and go to those meetings. You will have an opportunity to meet people. You have to be somewhat forward because it's going to be necessary. There are a lot of people who are trying to enter whatever avenue you may be seeking. So I think being active and finding those resources, institutions, associations that do meet and convene in your community are useful. Most students, as I did, spent a lot of time going to our professional academic associations, but that doesn't give you, at least at the time that I was doing it, many tentacles into the real world. So find those associations in the real world that would do it, and promote have your department have a channel that will enable a employer to make a placement of an ad, and that they would have a obvious place to come and place information about opportunities.
Teresa, Fernando, do you have any advice for non-academic careers or for students?
Well, yeah, we are needed everywhere, right? And so what we can learn in the university, what we can learn in the academy can be very valuable no matter what area we go into. But I think the number one thing that I would say that's really key is relationships, right? And how we engage in relationships. And people are nowadays, well, maybe forever, but it seems nowadays, are more careless about relationships. And I think that putting the effort and the time into maintaining and building and nurturing relationships not only make us a better society, but they certainly are. You cannot do the kind of work, certainly the kind of work I've done, but you can't do political work, you can't do social change work, you can't really do any of these professions without building relationships. Because whether or not somebody wants to take your phone call, for example, right, is really a function of, or whether someone takes your phone call is a function of whether they want to take your phone call, right? And so, and if you've built a relationship with them, they're more likely to take it than not. So just relationships, I think, are very important to nurture.
That was an affirmation.
Just to piggyback on what Teresa is saying, relationships are super important, but I think it's also important to somehow place yourself in the situations where you may become useful, and in a sense then find agency within that usefulness that may be multivariate. I think that there's a lot of need right now for conversations that happen across things, disciplines, fields, methods, and being able to translate rather than affirm is a new skill that I think that young professionals need to do that. I myself have been living in that mode because I studied political science as an undergraduate and then went to become sort of like an architect, an urban designer, but also did all kinds of other things. So I think that we all have those searches that we engage in our lives, and it's about placing ourselves in the situation where those searches can become actually longer-term professional development situations.
Thank you. And let's, a round of applause for the panel. Oh, actually, I'm going to close it. Oh, did you have one? Okay. I was told I got to close
I don't have a question. As a member of the public policy faculty, I want to just bridge to that question which is specific to students on the campus, which is to say that there is a certain divide between the professional schools down Hearst Avenue and the rest of the arts and sciences. And I do think that graduate students in the arts and sciences who are interested in moving outside of the academy could value a lot connecting with both the student groups and the faculty and advisors within the professional schools, of which there are many. And if you want to know more about this, you can talk to me, but I just wanted to put that as a UC Berkeley specific suggestion.
That's a very good one. Thank you. And on that note also, thank you to the panelists. Right now, I'm asked to say that there's lunch in the rear of the room, and to get your lunch, talk a bit, but I was encouraged to have you come back to your seats before 12 noon, is it? Around 12 noon? I'm sorry? 12:10.